Chapter 3 of Windsor Castle, Book 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Holdway. Windsor Castle, Book 1, by William H. Ainsworth. Chapter 3. Of the Grand Procession to Windsor Castle. Of the meeting of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn at the lower gate. Of their entrance into the castle, and how the butcher was hanged from the Curfew Tower. A joyous day was it for Windsor, and great were the preparations made by its loyal inhabitants for a suitable reception to their sovereign. At an early hour the town was thronged with strangers from the neighbouring villages, and later on crowds began to arrive from London, some having come along the highway on horseback, and others having rowed in various craft up the river. All were clad in holiday attire, and the streets presented an appearance of unwonted bustle and gaiety. The maypole in Bachelor's Acre was hung with flowers. Several booths, with flags floating above them, were erected in the same place, where ale, mead, and hippocras, together with cold pasties, hams, capons, and large joints of beef and mutton, might be obtained. Mummers and minstrels were in attendance, and every kind of diversion was going forward. Here was one party wrestling, there another casting the bar. On this side a set of rustics were dancing a merry round with a bevy of buxom Berkshire lasses. On that stood a fourth group, listening to a youth playing on the recorders. At one end of the acre large fires were lighted, before which 2 whole oxen were roasting, provided in honour of the occasion by the mayor and burgesses of the town. At the other, butts were set against which the Duke of Shoreditch and his companions, the 5 Marquis, were practising. The Duke himself shot admirably, and never failed to hit the bull's-eye, but the great feat of the day was performed by Morgan Fenwolf, who thrice split the Duke's shafts as they stuck in the mark. "Well done!" cried the Duke, as he witnessed the achievement. "Why, you shot as bravely as Herne the Hunter. Old wives tell us he used to split the arrows of his comrades in that fashion." "He must have learnt the trick from Herne himself in the forest," cried one of the bystanders. Morgan Fenwolf looked fiercely around in search of the speaker, but could not discern him. He, however, shot no more, and refusing a cup of hippocras offered him by Shoreditch, disappeared among the crowd. Soon after this the booths were emptied, the bar thrown down, the maypole and the butts deserted, and the whole of Bachelor's Acre cleared of its occupants, except those who were compelled to attend to the mighty spits turning before the fires, by the loud discharge of ordnance from the castle gates, accompanied by the ringing of bells, announcing that the mayor and burgesses of Windsor, together with the officers of the Order of the Garter, were setting forth to Datchet Bridge to meet the royal procession. Those who most promptly obeyed this summons beheld the lower castle gate, built by the then reigning monarch, open, while from it issued 4 trumpeters clad in emblazoned coats, with silken bandrols depending from their horns, blowing loud fanfares. They were followed by 12 henchmen, walking 4 abreast, arrayed in scarlet tunics, with the royal cipher H.R. worked in gold on the breast, and carrying gilt poleaxes over their shoulders. Next came a company of archers, equipped in helm and brigandine, and armed with long pikes, glittering, as did their steel accoutrements, in the bright sunshine. They were succeeded by the bailiffs and burgesses of the town, riding 3 abreast, and enveloped in gowns of scarlet cloth, after which rode the mayor of Windsor in a gown of crimson velvet, and attended by 2 footmen in white and red damask, carrying white wands. The mayor was followed by a company of the town guard, with partisans over the shoulders. Then came the sheriff of the county and his attendants. Next followed the 26 alms knights, for such was their number, walking 2 and 2, and wearing red mantles, with a scutcheon of St. George on the shoulder, but without the garter surrounding it. Then came the 13 petty canons, in murrey-coloured gowns, with the arms of St. George wrought in a roundel on the shoulder. Then the 12 canons, similarly attired, and lastly the dean of the college in his cope. A slight pause ensued, and the chief officers of the Garter made their appearance. First walked the Black Rod, clothed in a russet-coloured mantle, faced with alternate panes of blue and red, emblazoned with fleur-de-lis of gold and crowned lions. He carried a small black rod, the ensign of his office, surmounted with the Lion of England in silver. After the Black Rod came the Garter, habited in a gown of crimson satin, paned and emblazoned like that of the officer who preceded him, wearing a white crown with a sceptre upon it, and having a gilt crown in lieu of a cap upon his head. The Garter was followed by the Register, a grave personage, in a black gown, with a surplice over it, covered by a mantlet of furs. Then came the Chancellor of the Order, in his robe of murrey-coloured velvet lined with sarcenet, with a badge on the shoulder consisting of a gold rose, enclosed in a garter wrought with pearls of damask gold. Lastly came the Bishop of Winchester, the prelate of the order, wearing his mitre, and habited in a robe of crimson velvet lined with white taffeta, faced with blue, and embroidered on the right shoulder with a scutcheon of St. George, encompassed with the garter, and adorned with cordons of blue silk mingled with gold. Brought up by a rear guard of halberdiers, the procession moved slowly along Thames Street, the houses of which, as well as those in Pescott Street, were all more or less decorated, the humbler sort being covered with branches of trees intermingled with garlands of flowers, while the better description was hung with pieces of tapestry, carpets, and rich stuffs. Nor should it pass unnoticed that the loyalty of Brian Bonetance, the host of the Garter, had exhibited itself in an arch thrown across the road opposite his house, adorned with various coloured ribbons and flowers, in the midst of which was a large shield, exhibiting the letters B and H, in mystic allusion to Henry and Anne Boleyn, intermingled and surrounded by love-knots. Turning off on the left into the lower road, skirting the north of the castle, and following the course of the river to Datchet, by which it was understood the royal cavalcade would make its approach, the procession arrived at an open space by the side of the river, where it came to a halt, and the dean, chancellor, and prelate, together with other officers of the Garter, embarked in a barge moored to the bank, which was towed slowly down the stream in the direction of Datchet Bridge, a band of minstrels stationed within it playing all the time. Meanwhile the rest of the cavalcade, having again set forward, pursued their course along the banks of the river, proceeding at a foot's pace and accompanied by crowds of spectators, cheering them as they moved along. The day was bright and beautiful, and nothing was wanting to enhance the beauty of the spectacle. On the left flowed the silver Thames, crowded with craft, filled with richly dressed personages of both sexes, amid which floated the pompous barge appropriated to the officers of the Garter, which was hung with banners and streamers, and decorated at the sides with targets, emblazoned with the arms of St. George. On the greensward edging the stream marched a brilliant cavalcade, and on the right lay the old woods of the home park, with long vistas opening through them, giving exquisite peeps of the towers and battlements of the castle. Half an hour brought the cavalcade to Datchet Bridge, at the foot of which a pavilion was erected for the accommodation of the mayor and burgesses, and here, having dismounted, they awaited the king's arrival. Shortly after this a cloud of dust on the Staines Road seemed to announce the approach of the royal party, and all rushed forth and held themselves in readiness to meet it. But the dust appeared to have been raised by a company of horsemen, headed by Captain Bouchier, who rode up the next moment. Courteously saluting the mayor, Bouchier informed him that Mistress Anne Boleyn was close behind, and that it was the king's pleasure that she should be attended in all state to the lower gate of the castle, there to await his coming, as he himself intended to enter it with her. The mayor replied that the sovereign's behests should be implicitly obeyed, and he thereupon stationed himself at the farther side of the bridge in expectation of Anne Boleyn's arrival. Presently the sound of trumpets smote his ear, and a numerous and splendid retinue was seen advancing, consisting of nobles, knights, esquires, and gentlemen, ranged according to their degrees, and all sumptuously apparelled in cloths of gold and silver, and velvets of various colours, richly embroidered. Besides these, there were pages and other attendants in the liveries of their masters, together with sergeants of the guard, and henchmen in their full accoutrements. Among the nobles were the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, the king being desirous of honouring as much as possible her whom he had resolved to make his queen. The former was clothed in tissue, embroidered with roses of gold, with a baldric across his body of massive gold, and was mounted on a charger likewise trapped in gold, and the latter wore a mantle of cloth of silver, pounced in the form of letters, and lined with blue velvet, while his horse was trapped hardwise in harness, embroidered with bullion gold curiously wrought. Both also wore the collar of the Order of the Garter. Near them rode Sir Thomas Boleyn, who, conscious of the dignity to which his daughter was to be advanced, comported himself with almost intolerable haughtiness. Immediately behind Sir Thomas Boleyn came a sumptuous litter covered with cloth of gold, drawn by 4 white palfreys, caparisoned in white damask down to the ground, and each having a page in white and blue satin at its head. Over the litter was borne a canopy of cloth of gold, supported by 4 gilt staves, and ornamented at the corners with silver bells, ringing forth sweet music as it moved along. Each staff was borne by a knight, of whom 16 were in attendance, to relieve one another when fatigued. In this litter sat Anne Boleyn. She wore a surcoat of white tissue, and a mantle of the same material lined with ermine. Her gown, which, however, was now concealed by the surcoat, was of cloth of gold tissue, raised with pearls of silver damask, with a stomacher of purple gold similarly raised, and large open sleeves lined with checkered tissue. Around her neck she wore a chain of orient pearls, from which depended a diamond cross. A black velvet cap, richly embroidered with pearls and other precious stones, and ornamented with a small white plume, covered her head, and her small feet were hidden in blue velvet broderkins, decorated with diamond stars. Anne Boleyn's features were exquisitely formed, and though not regular, far more charming than if they had been so. Her nose was slightly aquiline, but not enough so to detract from its beauty, and had a little retrousse, point that completed its attraction. The rest of her features were delicately chiselled, the chin being beautifully rounded, the brow smooth and white as snow, while the rose could not vie with the bloom of her cheek. Her neck, alas that the fell hand of the executioner should ever touch it, was long and slender, her eyes large and blue, and of irresistible witchery, sometimes scorching the beholder like a sunbeam, anon melting him with soul-subduing softness. Of her accomplishments other opportunities will be found to speak, but it may be mentioned that she was skilled of many instruments, danced and sang divinely, and had rare powers of conversation and wit. If to these she had not added the dangerous desire to please, and the wish to hold other hearts than the royal one she had enslaved in thraldom, all might, perhaps, have been well. But, alas, like many other beautiful women, she had a strong tendency to coquetry. How severely she suffered for it, it is the purpose of this history to relate. An excellent description of her has been given by a contemporary writer, the Comte de Chateaubriand, who, while somewhat disparaging her personal attractions, speaks in rapturous terms of her accomplishments.
Anne, writes the Comte, avait un esprit si délié que c'était à qui l'ouïrait dégoiser, et si venait-elle à poétiser, tel qu'Orpheus, elle eût fait les ours et rochers attentifs, puis sautait, ballait et dansait toutes danses anglaises ou étranges, et en imagina nombre qui ont garde son nom, ou celui du galant pour qui il est fait, puis savait tous les jeux, qu'elle jouait avec non plus d'heure que d'habileté, puis chantait comme sirène, s'accompagnant de luth, harpait mieux que le roi David, et maniait fort gentiment flûte et rebec, puis s'accoutrait de tant et si merveilleuses façons, que ses inventions faisaient d'elle le parangon de toutes les dames les plus sucrées de la cour, mais nulle n'avait sa grâce, laquelle, au dire d'un ancien, passe Vénuste.
Such was the opinion of one who knew her well during her residence at the French court, when in attendance on Mary of England, consort of Louis XII, and afterwards Duchess of Suffolk. At this moment Anne's eyes were fixed with some tenderness upon one of the supporters of her canopy on the right, a very handsome young man, attired in a doublet and hose of black tilsent, paned and cut, and whose tall, well-proportioned figure was seen to be the greatest advantage, inasmuch as he had divested himself of his mantle, for his better convenience in walking. "I fear me you will fatigue yourself, Sir Thomas Wyat," said Anne Boleyn, in tones of musical sweetness, which made the heart beat and the colour mount to the cheeks of him she addressed. "You had better allow Sir Thomas Arundel or Sir John Hulstone to relieve you." "I can feel no fatigue when near you, madame," replied Wyat, in a low tone. A slight blush overspread Anne's features, and she raised her embroidered kerchief to her lips. "If I had that kerchief, I would wear it at the next lists, and defy all comers," said Wyat. "You shall have it, then," rejoined Anne. "I love all chivalrous exploits, and will do my best to encourage them." "Take heed, Sir Thomas," said Sir Francis Weston, the knight who held the staff on the other side, "or we shall have the canopy down. Let Sir Thomas Arundel relieve you." "No," rejoined Wyat, recovering himself. "I will not rest till we come to the bridge." "You are in no haste to possess the kerchief," said Anne petulantly. "There you wrong me, madame," cried Sir Thomas eagerly. "What ho, good fellows!" he shouted to the attendants at the palfreys' heads. "Your lady desires you to stop." "And I desire them to go on. I, Will Somers, jester to the high and mighty King Harry VIII, cried a voice of mock authority behind the knight. "What if Sir Thomas Wyat has undertaken to carry the canopy farther than any of his companions? Is that a reason he should be relieved? Of a surety not. Go on, I say." The person who thus spoke then stepped forward, and threw a glance so full of significance at Anne Boleyn that she did not care to dispute the order, but, on the contrary, laughingly acquiesced in it. Will Somers, the king's jester, as he described himself, was a small, middle-aged personage, with a physiognomy in which good nature and malice, folly and shrewdness were so oddly blended, that it was difficult to say which predominated. His look was cunning and sarcastic, but it was tempered by great drollery and oddity of manner, and he laughed so heartily at his own jests and jibes that it was scarcely possible to help joining him. His attire consisted of a long loose gown of spotted crimson silk, with the royal cipher woven in front in gold, hose of blue cloth, guarded with red and black cloth, and red cordovan buskins. A sash tied round his waist served him instead of a girdle, and he wore a trencher-shaped velvet cap on his head, with a white tufted feather in it. In his hand he carried a small horn. He was generally attended by a monkey, habited in a crimson doublet and hood, which sat upon his shoulder, and played very diverting tricks. But the animal was not with him on the present occasion. Will Somers was a great favourite with the king, and ventured upon familiarities which no one else dared to use with him. The favour in which he stood with his royal master procured him admittance to his presence at all hours and at all seasons, and his influence, though seldom exerted, was very great. He was especially serviceable in turning aside the edge of the king's displeasure, and more frequently exerted himself to allay the storm than to raise it. His principal hostility was directed against Wolsey, whose arrogance and grasping practices were the constant subjects of his railing. It was seldom, such was his privileged character, and the protection he enjoyed from the sovereign, that any of the courtiers resented his remarks. But Sir Thomas Wyat's feelings being now deeply interested, he turned sharply round, and said, "How now, thou meddling varlet? What business hast thou to interfere?" "I interfere to prove my authority, gossip Wyat," replied Somers, "and to show that, varlet as I am as powerful as Mistress Anne Boleyn. Nay, that I am yet more powerful, because I am obeyed, while she is not." "Were I at liberty," said Sir Thomas angrily, I would make thee repent thine insolence." "Ha! But thou art not at liberty, good gossip," replied the jester, screaming with laughter. "Thou art tied like a slave to the oar, and cannot free thyself from it." Having enjoyed the knight's discomposure for a few seconds, he advanced towards him and whispered in his ear, "Don't mistake me, gossip. I have done thee good service in preventing thee from taking that kerchief. Hadst thou received it in the presence of these witnesses, thou wouldst have been lodged in the Round Tower of Windsor Castle to-morrow, instead of feasting with the knights' companions in St. George's Hall." "I believe thou art right, gossip," said Wyat in the same tone. "Rest assured I am," replied Somers, "and I furthermore counsel thee to decline this dangerous gift altogether, and to think no more of the fair profferer, or if thou must think of her, let it be as one beyond thy reach. Cross not the lion's path. Take a friendly hint from the jackal." And without waiting for a reply, he darted away, and mingled with the cavalcade in the rear. Immediately behind Anne Boleyn's litter rode a company of henchmen of the royal household, armed with gilt partisans. Next succeeded a chariot covered with red cloth of gold, and drawn by 4 horses richly caparisoned, containing the old Duchess of Norfolk and the old Marchioness of Dorset. Then came the king's natural son, the Duke of Richmond, a young man formed on the same large scale, and distinguished by the same haughty port and the same bluff manner as his royal sire. The Duke's mother was the Lady Talboys, esteemed one of the most beautiful women of the age, and who had for a long time held the capricious monarch captive. Henry was warmly attached to his son, showered favours without number upon him, and might have done yet more if fate had not snatched him away at an early age. Though scarcely 18, the Duke of Richmond looked more than 20, and his lips and chin were clothed with a well-grown though closely clipped beard. He was magnificently habited in a doublet of cloth of gold of bawdekin, the placard and sleeves of which were wrought with flat gold and fastened with aiglets. A girdle of crimson velvet, enriched with precious stones, encircled his waist, and sustained a poniard and a Toledo sword, damascened with gold. Over all he wore a loose robe, or housse, of scarlet mohair, trimmed with minever, and was further decorated with the collar of the Order of the Garter. His cap was of white velvet, ornamented with emeralds, and from the side depended a small azure plume. He rode a magnificent black charger, trapped in housings of cloth of gold, powdered with ermine. By the Duke's side rode the Earl of Surrey, attired as upon the previous day, and mounted on a fiery Arabian, trapped in crimson velvet, fringed with Venetian gold. Both nobles were attended by their esquires in their liveries. Behind them came a chariot covered with cloth of silver, and drawn, like the first, by 4 horses in rich housings, containing 2 very beautiful damsels, one of whom attracted so much of the attention of the youthful nobles that it was with difficulty they could preserve due order of march. The young dame in question was about 17. Her face was oval in form, with features of the utmost delicacy and regularity. Her complexion was fair and pale, and contrasted strikingly with her jetty brows and magnificent black eyes, of oriental size, tenderness, and lustre. Her dark and luxuriant tresses were confined by a cap of black velvet, faced with white satin, and ornamented with pearls. Her gown was of white satin worked with gold, and had long open pendant sleeves, while from her slender and marble neck hung a cordeliere, a species of necklace imitated from the cord worn by Franciscan friars, and formed of crimson silk twisted with threads of Venetian gold. This fair creature was the Lady Elizabeth Fitzgerald, daughter of Gerald Fitzgerald, 9th Earl of Kildare, who claimed descent from the Geraldi family of Florence, but she was generally known by the appellation of the Fair Geraldine, a title bestowed upon her, on account of her beauty, by the king, and by which she still lives, and will continue to live as long as poetry endures, in the deathless and enchanting strains of her lover, the Earl of Surrey. At the instance of her mother, Lady Kildare, the fair Geraldine was brought up with the Princess Mary, afterwards Queen of England, but she had been lately assigned by the royal order as one of the attendants, a post equivalent to that of maid of honour to Anne Boleyn. Her companion was the Lady Mary Howard, the sister of the Earl of Surrey, a nymph about her own age, and possessed of great personal attractions, having nobly formed features, radiant blue eyes, light tresses, and a complexion of dazzling clearness. Lady Mary Howard nourished a passion for the Duke of Richmond, whom she saw with secret chagrin, captivated by the superior charms of the fair Geraldine. Her uneasiness, however, was in some degree abated by the knowledge, which as confidant of the latter she had obtained, that her brother was master of her heart. Lady Mary was dressed in blue velvet, cut and lined with cloth of gold, and wore a headgear of white velvet, ornamented with pearls. Just as the cavalcade came in sight of Datchet Bridge, the Duke of Richmond turned his horse's head, and rode up to the side of the chariot on which the fair Geraldine was sitting. "I am come to tell you of a marvellous adventure that befell Surrey in the home park at Windsor last night," he said. "He declares he has seen the demon hunter Herne." "Then pray let the Earl of Surrey relate the adventure to us himself," replied the fair Geraldine. "No one can tell a story so well as the hero of it." The Duke signed to the youthful Earl, who was glancing rather wistfully at them, and he immediately joined them, while Richmond passed over to the Lady Mary Howard. Surrey then proceeded to relate what had happened to him in the park, and the fair Geraldine listened to his recital with breathless interest. "Heaven shield us from evil spirits!" she exclaimed, crossing herself. "But what is the history of this wicked hunter, my lord? And why did he incur such a dreadful doom?" "I know nothing more than that he was a keeper in the forest, who, having committed some heinous crime, hanged himself from a branch of the oak beneath which I found the keeper, Morgan Fenwolf, and which still bears his name," replied the Earl. "For this unrighteous act he cannot obtain rest, but is condemned to wander through the forests at midnight, where he wreaks his vengeance in blasting the trees." "The legend I have heard differs from yours," observed the Duke of Richmond. "It runs that the spirit by which the forest is haunted is a wood demon, who assumes the shape of the ghostly hunter, and seeks to tempt or terrify the keepers to sell their souls to him." "Your Grace's legend is the better of the two," said Lady Mary Howard, "or rather, I should say, the more probable. I trust the evil spirit did not make you any such offer, brother of Surrey?" The Earl gravely shook his head. "If I were to meet him, and he offered me my heart's dearest wish, I fear he would prevail with me," observed the Duke, glancing tenderly at the fair Geraldine. "Tush! This subject is too serious for jesting, Richmond," said Surrey almost sternly. "His Grace, as is usual in compacts with the fiend, may have reason to rue his bargain," observed Lady Mary Howard peevishly. "If the Earl of Surrey were my brother," remarked the fair Geraldine to the Lady Mary, "I would interdict him from roaming in the park after nightfall." "He is very wilful," said Lady Mary, smiling, "and holds my commands but lightly." "Let the fair Geraldine lay hers upon me, and she shall not have to reproach me with disobedience," rejoined the Earl. "I must interpose to prevent their utterance," cried Richmond, with a somewhat jealous look at his friend, "for I have determined to know more of this mystery, and shall require the Earl's assistance to unravel it. I think I remember Morgan Fenwolf, the keeper, and will send for him to the castle, and question him. But in any case, I and Surrey will visit Herne's Oak to-night." The remonstrances of both ladies were interrupted by the sudden appearance of Will Somers. "What ho, my lords! To your places, to your places!" cried the jester in a shrill, angry voice. See ye not we are close upon Datchet Bridge? Ye can converse with these fair dames at a more fitting season, but it is the king's pleasure that the cavalcade should make a goodly show. To your places, I say!" Laughing at the jester's peremptory injunction, the two young nobles nevertheless obeyed it, and, bending almost to the saddle-bow to the ladies, resumed their posts. The concourse assembled on Datchet Bridge welcomed Anne Boleyn's arrival with loud acclamations, while joyous strains proceeded from sackbut and psaltery, and echoing blasts from the trumpets. Caps were flung into the air, and a piece of ordnance was fired from the barge, which was presently afterwards answered by the castle guns. Having paid his homage to Anne Boleyn, the mayor rejoined the company of bailiffs and burgesses, and the whole cavalcade crossed the bridge, winding their way slowly along the banks of the river, the barge, with the minstrels playing in it, accompanying them the while. In this way they reached Windsor, and as Anne Boleyn gazed up at the lordly castle above which the royal standard now floated, proud and aspiring thoughts swelled her heart, and she longed for the hour when she should approach it as its mistress. Just then her eye chanced on Sir Thomas Wyat, who was riding behind her amongst the knights, and she felt, though it might cost her a struggle, that love would yield to ambition. Leaving the barge and its occupants to await the king's arrival, the cavalcade ascended Thames Street, and were welcomed everywhere with acclamations and rejoicing. Brian Bountance, who had stationed himself on the right of the arch in front of his house, attempted to address Anne Boleyn, but could not bring forth a word. His failure, however, was more successful than his speech might have been, inasmuch as it excited abundance of merriment. Arrived at the area in front of the lower gateway, Anne Boleyn's litter was drawn up in the midst of it, and the whole of the cavalcade grouping around her presented a magnificent sight to the archers and arquebusiers stationed on the towers and walls. Just at this moment a signal gun was heard from Datchet Bridge, announcing that the king had reached it, and the Dukes of Suffolk, Norfolk, and Richmond, together with the Earl of Surrey, Sir Thomas Wyat, and a few of their gentlemen, rode back to meet him. They had scarcely, however, reached the foot of the hill when the royal party appeared in view, for the king, with his characteristic impatience, on drawing near the castle, had urged his attendants quickly forward. First came half a dozen trumpeters, with silken bandrols fluttering in the breeze, blowing loud flourishes. Then a party of halberdiers, whose leaders had pennons streaming from the tops of their tall pikes. Next came two gentlemen ushers, bareheaded, but mounted and richly habited, belonging to the Cardinal of York, who cried out as they pressed forward, "On before, my masters! On before! Make way for my lord's grace!" Then came a sergeant of arms bearing a great mace of silver, and two gentlemen carrying each a pillar of silver. Next rode a gentleman carrying the cardinal's hat, and after him came Wolsey himself, mounted on a mule trapped in crimson velvet, with a saddle covered with the same stuff, and gilt stirrups. His large person was arrayed in robes of the finest crimson satin ingrained, and a silk cap of the same colour contrasted by its brightness with the pale purple tint of his sullen, morose, and bloated features. The cardinal took no notice of the clamour around him, but now and then, when an expression of dislike was uttered against him, for he had already begun to be unpopular with the people, he would raise his eyes and direct a withering glance at the hardy speaker. But these expressions were few, for, though tottering, Wolsey was yet too formidable to be insulted with impunity. On either side of him were two mounted attendants, each carrying a gilt poleaxe, who, if he had given the word, would have instantly chastised the insolence of the bystanders, while behind him rode his two cross-bearers upon homes trapped in scarlet. Wolsey's princely retinue was followed by a litter of crimson velvet, in which lay the Pope's legate, Cardinal Campeggio, whose infirmities were so great that he could not move without assistance. Campeggio was likewise attended by a numerous train. After a long line of lords, knights, and esquires came Henry VIII. He was apparelled in a robe of crimson velvet furred with ermines, and wore a doublet of raised gold, the placard of which was embroidered with diamonds, rubies, emeralds, large pearls, and other precious stones. About his neck was a baldric of balas rubies, and over his robe he wore the collar of the Order of the Garter. His horse, a charger of the largest size, and well able to sustain his vast weight, was trapped in crimson velvet, purfled with ermines. His knights and esquires were clothed in purple velvet, and his henchmen in scarlet tunics of the same make as those worn by the warders of the Tower at the present day. Henry was in his 38th year, and though somewhat overgrown and heavy, had lost none of his activity, and but little of the grace of his noble proportions. His size and breadth of limb were well displayed in his magnificent habiliment. His countenance was handsome and manly, with a certain broad burly look, thoroughly English in its character, which won him much admiration from his subjects, and though it might be objected that the eyes were too small, and the mouth somewhat too diminutive, it could not be denied that the general expression of the face was kingly in the extreme. A prince of a more royal presence than Henry VIII was never seen, and though he had many and grave faults, want of dignity was not amongst the number. Henry entered Windsor amid the acclamations of the spectators, the fanfares of trumpeters, and the roar of ordnance from the castle walls. Meanwhile Anne Boleyn, having descended from her litter, which passed through the gate into the lower ward, stood with her ladies beneath the canopy awaiting his arrival. A wide clear space was preserved before her, into which, however, Wolsey penetrated, and dismounting, placed himself so that he could witness the meeting between her and the king. Behind him stood the jester, Will Somers, who was equally curious with himself. The litter of Cardinal Campeggio passed through the gateway, and proceeded to the lodgings reserved for his eminence. Scarcely had Wolsey taken up his station than Henry rode up, and, alighting, consigned his horse to a page, and, followed by the Duke of Richmond and the Earl of Surrey, advanced towards Anne Boleyn, who immediately stepped forward to meet him. "Fair mistress," he said, taking her hand, and regarding her with a look of passionate devotion, "I welcome you to this my castle of Windsor, and trust soon to make you as absolute mistress of it as I am lord and master." Anne Boleyn blushed, and cast down her eyes, and Sir Thomas Wyat, who stood at some little distance, with his hand upon his saddle, regarding her, felt that any hopes he might have entertained were utterly annihilated. "Heard you that, my Lord Cardinal?" said Will Somers to Wolsey. "She will soon be mistress here. As she comes in, you go out. Mind that." The cardinal made no answer further than was conveyed by the deepened colour of his cheeks. Amid continued fanfares and acclamations, Harry then led Anne Boleyn through the gateway, followed by the ladies in waiting, who were joined by Richmond and Surrey. The prelate, chancellor, register, Black Rod, and other officers of the Garter, together with the whole of the royal retinue who had dismounted, came after them. A vast concourse of spectators, extending almost as far as the Lieutenant's Tower, was collected in front of the alms knights' houses, but a wide space had been kept clear by the henchmen for the passage of the sovereign and his train, and along this Henry proceeded with Anne Boleyn in the direction of the upper ward. Just as he reached the Norman Tower, and passed the entrance to the keep, the Duke of Shoreditch, who was standing beneath the gateway, advanced towards him, and prostrated himself on one knee. "May it please your majesty," said Shoreditch, "I last night arrested a butcher of Windsor for uttering words highly disrespectful of your highness, and of the fair and virtuous lady by your side." "Ah, God's death!" exclaimed the king. "Where is the traitor? Bring him before us." "He is here," replied Shoreditch. And immediately Mark Fytton was brought forward by a couple of halberdiers. He still preserved his undaunted demeanour, and gazed sternly at the king. "So, fellow, thou hast dared to speak disrespectfully of us? Ha!" cried Henry. "I have spoken the truth," replied the butcher fearlessly. "I have said you were about to divorce your lawful consort, Catherine of Aragon, and to take the minion Anne Boleyn, who stands beside you, to your bed. And I added, it was a wrongful act." "Foul befall thy lying tongue for saying so," replied Henry furiously. "I have a mind to pluck it from thy throat, and cast it to the dogs. What ho, guards! Take this caitiff to the summit of the highest tower of the castle, the Curfew Tower, and hang him from it, so that all my loyal subjects in Windsor may see how traitors are served." "Your Highness has judged him justly," said Anne Boleyn. "You may say so now, Mistress Anne Boleyn," rejoined the butcher, "but you yourself shall one day stand in as much peril of your life as I do, and shall plead as vainly as I should, were I to plead at all, which I will never do to this inexorable tyrant. You will then remember my end." "Away with him!" cried Henry. "I myself will go to the Garter Tower to see it done." "Farewell for a short while, sweetheart. I will read these partisans of Catherine a terrible lesson." As the butcher was hurried off to the Curfew Tower, the king proceeded with his attendants to the Garter Tower, and ascended to its summit. In less than 10 minutes a stout pole, like the mast of a ship, was thrust through the battlements of the Curfew Tower, on the side looking towards the town. To this pole a rope of some dozen feet in length, and having a noose at one end, was firmly secured. The butcher was then brought forth, bound hand and foot, and the noose was thrown over his neck. While this was passing, the wretched man descried a person looking at him from a window in a wooden structure projecting from the side of the tower. "What, are you there, Morgan Fenwolf?" he cried. "Remember what passed between us in the dungeon last night, and be warned. You will not meet your end as firmly as I meet mine." "Make thy shrift quickly, fellow, if thou hast aught to say," interposed one of the halberdiers. "I have no shrift to make," rejoined the butcher. "I have already settled my account with heaven. God preserve Queen Catherine!" As he uttered these words, he was thrust off from the battlements by the halberdiers, and his body swung into the abyss amid the hootings and execrations of the spectators below. Having glutted his eyes with the horrible sight, Henry descended from the tower, and returned to Anne Boleyn. End of chapter 3.